This is the story of Jehonadab, son of Rechab, a man whose quiet obedience shaped a family for generations. His life teaches one powerful truth. God honors families that live by righteous principles across generations. Once upon a time, in the hills of Israel where the wind could strip a voice to a whisper, a clan called the Rechabites lived without walls, moving their tents like shepherds and travelers. They were known for 3 simple rules handed down by their father, Jehonadab, son of Rechab: do not drink wine, do not build houses, do not plant fields. Live light, he would say, so your hearts stay free to obey God. On a clear morning, Jehonadab walked a ridge road with 2 young men from his clan. Their tent camp lay below, tied down like a ship in a quiet harbor. He carried no sword, only a walking staff, and that stubborn set to his jaw that told everyone he was already decided about the day. "Why the rules, father?" the taller youth asked, keeping pace. "Everyone else builds stone houses. Everyone else has vines." Jehonadab didn't slow. "Stone forgets. Vines invite pride. We remember better in tents." He tapped the staff against the road. "Wine dulls a man's edge. We will need a clear edge." The other youth glanced at the horizon, where the road dropped toward a dusty plain. "Need it for what?" "For the work God sets in our days," Jehonadab said. "A clear mind, a willing spine, clean hands." They rounded a bend, and the wind shifted, carrying the faint thunder of hooves. Dust shivered off the far road like smoke. Travelers dove for the ditch. A chariot flashed in the sun, fast, hard, driven by a man whose name had started running faster than the wheels: Jehu. Rumors had reached even the tents. Jehu, the commander turned king, was cutting down the house of Ahab and smashing Baal's cult with iron certainty. Some said he went too far. Others said he didn't go far enough. Jehonadab had not answered those whispers. He had only said, "We will see the man ourselves." The chariot leapt closer. Jehu stood braced inside it, hair swept back, eyes like sparks. He saw the 3 figures on the ridge road and yanked the reins. The horses screamed to a halt in a spray of gravel. The air went still. Jehu stared at Jehonadab as if weighing him on a scale only he could see. "Are you Jehonadab, son of Rechab?" Jehu called, voice sharp, no greeting wasted. "I am," Jehonadab answered. He didn't step back. He didn't bow. He simply planted his staff and waited. Jehu's gaze cut to the youths, then back. "Is your heart honest toward me, as mine is toward you?" Jehonadab held the king's eyes. This was not about flattery, it was about aim. "If your hand is set to pull down idols and not to feed your pride," he said slowly, "then my heart is with you." Jehu's mouth twisted into something like a smile. He thrust out his arm. "Give me your hand." Jehonadab stepped forward, gripped Jehu's wrist, and felt the pull. In a breath he was in the chariot, standing beside a man who moved like a blade. The 2 youths held their place on the road, wide-eyed, waiting for some sign. Jehonadab gave them one nod, the kind that meant hold the line, keep the rules, guard the tents. "Come with me," Jehu said, snapping the reins. The horses lunged. "See my zeal for the Lord." The chariot tore down the slope. Wind hammered their faces. Town walls rose ahead, then the black mouth of a gate, then streets that smelled of hot dust and fear. Jehu did not slow. He drove straight toward the square where a tall house stood, a house with carvings and curtains, a house people entered with their heads low and came out with their souls bent. Baal's place. Jehonadab gripped the rail. He had asked for aim. Now he would see it up close. Jehu hauled the horses to a stop, vaulted out, and barked to his men. Orders flew. Doors opened. A stream of robed priests and loyalists began to file into the temple at a royal summons Jehu had sent ahead of time. Jehonadab felt the air change. The sharp scent of a trap sprung tight. "Stand with me," Jehu said, 1 foot already on the threshold. "If I burn rot out of Israel, I want the Rechabites to witness it." Jehonadab stepped beside him, jaw like iron. This was justice, yes. But justice can sour into cruelty if no one clean is watching. From the doorway he could see the whole hall. Pillars, wrapped with bright cloth, a crowd pressed shoulder to shoulder, eager for a ceremony that would never come. Jehu turned once more. "You wanted to see my aim," he said. "You will see it now." Jehonadab's eyes slid to a side alcove where gold glinted, offerings piled high. Soldiers drifted that way like flies, hands already itching. Jehonadab's voice cut across the doorway, even and cold. "Touch nothing for yourselves." A few helmets tilted toward him. Jehu's head snapped, catching the flash of greed. For an instant the new king read the room and changed the air with a single glance. "Nothing," Jehu barked. "We are not here to fatten our pockets." The soldiers froze. The trap door swung shut behind the crowd inside. Bolts slammed. A signal rose. Jehonadab drew a long breath. This would end a chapter of Israel's idolatry or begin a new corruption under a different name. He could feel the hinge of it in his ribs. "Ready?" Jehu asked. Jehonadab didn't answer with words. He nodded once. And from the far side of the temple, someone began to run, robes flying, mouth open, eyes locked on Jehonadab as if a warning had been meant only for him. The roar began before Jehonadab could see the source. From within Baal's temple came the fevered chant of worshippers, hundreds of voices calling to a god who could not hear them. Drums pounded. Incense choked the air. The temple was built to impress fools, columns plated in gold leaf, walls carved with sun discs and ox heads, altars blackened with the smoke of false offerings. Jehu stood in the doorway beside Jehonadab, breathing hard, his eyes lit with the cold fire of zeal. "Look at them," he said through his teeth. "They bow to nothing and call it holy." Jehonadab answered quietly. "Then strike, but let it be the Lord's justice, not your rage." Jehu's jaw tightened. He gave a sharp signal. Instantly, soldiers poured through side entrances, closing off every door. The crowd of priests looked up in confusion. Their chants faltered. One of them, an older man with paint smeared across his cheeks, stepped forward and lifted trembling hands. "My lord Jehu, you said there would be a great sacrifice today." "There will be," Jehu said. His arm dropped. The soldiers advanced. Swords flashed. The noise exploded into chaos, shouts, metal, crashing wood, the thud of falling bodies, the smell of blood cut through the incense. Jehonadab turned his face aside, not from fear, but from sorrow. He had lived long enough to know what sin demanded, yet still his heart ached at the sight. When it was done, smoke drifted from the open roof and only silence remained. Jehu wiped his blade on a fallen priest's robe and turned toward Jehonadab. "Thus perishes Baal." Jehonadab stepped into the wreckage, his sandals scraping across stone slick with ash. He studied the shattered idols, their faces broken, their hollow eyes staring at nothing. "You have done what the Lord commanded," he said slowly. "But remember this, Jehu. The end of wickedness is not the beginning of righteousness. Purge their sin, but do not replace it with pride. Jehu's brow furrowed. You speak like a priest. I speak like a watchman, Jehonadab replied. Justice must be clean, or it becomes another idol. For a long moment they faced each other, two men bound by zeal but shaped by very different fires. Then Jehu's expression softened. You are a strange man, son of Rechab. Your hands hold no weapon, yet your words cut deeper than iron. Jehonadab looked toward the horizon where smoke curled above the city. Words last longer than swords. Outside, the soldiers began piling the idols, dragging broken pillars into the streets. The air shimmered with heat as Jehu ordered the entire temple burned. Flames leapt high, black smoke coiling into the blue sky. People watched from rooftops astonished. Some shouted praises to Jehu, others hid behind closed doors, uncertain whether to fear or rejoice. Jehonadab walked among the soldiers as they worked, watching them closely. It was easy, in the flush of victory, for men to forget the holiness of the moment. Already he saw a few snatching gold trinkets from the wreckage. His voice cracked like a whip. Leave it! The men froze, caught like thieves in daylight. The things that served false gods are cursed, Jehonadab said. Do not trade your souls for glitter. Word of his warning spread, and even Jehu paused to glance his way. He guards the fire, Jehu muttered. Good. Every king needs a man like that. As the sun set, Jehu and Jehonadab climbed the city wall to look down at the smoking ruins. The wind carried the stench of burned idols across the plain. It is finished, Jehu said, satisfaction heavy in his tone. Jehonadab's gaze drifted toward the hills beyond Samaria, where faintly, through the haze, he could see the shape of two golden calves standing in distant shrines, the same idols Jeroboam had raised generations before. Not finished, he said softly. Those still stand. Jehu followed his eyes and scowled. Those are for the northern tribes to remember their place. They are symbols, not gods. Jehonadab's heart sank. Symbols become gods when men bow to them. You cannot build righteousness on half obedience. Jehu turned sharply. You speak boldly to a king. To a king, yes, Jehonadab said, but more to a man who will answer to the king above. For a moment, Jehu's hand twitched toward his sword, then fell away. He laughed instead, a short, harsh sound. You have courage, old man. I will grant you that he clapped Jehonadab on the shoulder. But understand this. I have done what God commanded. The rest is mine to rule as I see fit. Jehonadab's eyes met his. Then may he judge between us. The two men stood in silence as darkness swallowed the city. The firelight below flickered against the wall, painting their faces, one hardened with triumph, the other heavy with warning. At last Jehonadab spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. My people will remain in tents. We will drink no wine, build no houses, sow no fields. When kings rise and fall, our obedience will not. Jehu frowned, almost amused. You think your tents will last longer than my throne? Jehonadab turned toward the desert, where stars began to burn above the hills. Yes, he said simply, because we follow a God who does not decay. The next morning, Jehu's messengers rode out to announce the purge across Israel. Songs were sung, stories were told, and Jehu's name became a legend. Yet in the quiet valleys, Jehonadab's family packed their tents and moved deeper into the wilderness, far from palaces and politics. They carried no trophies, only the same 3 vows: no wine, no walls, no fields. As the sun rose over the scorched city, Jehonadab looked back one last time. Smoke still curled from Baal's temple, but beyond it, far beyond, those golden calves still gleamed in the distance. He whispered under his breath, "Lord, if kings forget you, let my sons remember." The wind carried his words eastward into the desert like a seed waiting for its time. The days after the purge were filled with celebration. Jehu's soldiers feasted, the city of Samaria rang with music, and word spread across the land that the idols of Baal were gone. For the first time in years, the people felt safe. But Jehonadab knew better. Idolatry didn't die with its statues, it lived inside hearts. On the third evening, Jehu summoned Jehonadab to the royal courtyard. Torches lined the walkway, their flames twisting in the night air. The king sat at a long table, golden cups before him, his captains loud with laughter. Plates of roasted meat filled the air with rich smoke, and wine gleamed like rubies in tall jars. Jehonadab entered quietly, nodding once to the guards. Jehu raised his hand. "Jehonadab, my friend, come, sit. You've stood beside me in battle. Now share in peace." Jehonadab took his seat, though his eyes moved over the scene with measured calm. "Peace," he said softly. "It is easy to confuse it with victory." Jehu grinned. "You're a man of riddles. Come, taste the king's wine." He poured a cup himself and slid it across the table. "To our triumph." Jehonadab did not move. "I made a vow," he said. "My family does not drink wine. We live as strangers in the land, waiting on the Lord, not comfort." The laughter at the table dimmed. Jehu's captains exchanged uncertain looks. The king leaned back, eyeing Jehonadab with both curiosity and irritation. "Still keeping your tent vows even here among kings?" Jehonadab met his gaze. "Especially among kings." Jehu studied him for a moment, then laughed again, though this time it sounded thinner. "You truly are your father's son. You think holiness lives in discomfort?" Jehonadab folded his hands. "I think holiness lives in obedience." The table went quiet. Even the torches seemed to hiss in the pause. Jehu broke the silence by slamming his cup down, splashing wine across the table. "Do you mean to lecture me? I've cleansed Israel of Baal. I've done what no man dared." Jehonadab's voice stayed steady. "You did what God commanded, but not what he desired." Jehu's brow darkened. "Explain yourself." "You tore down Baal," Jehonadab said, "but the calves of Jeroboam still stand. You destroyed one idol and blessed another. You cut the weeds but left their roots." For a long moment Jehu said nothing. His fingers tapped the edge of his cup. Then he forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You live in tents, Jehonadab. You know little of ruling a nation. I've kept peace. I've restored order. And I've done it all for the Lord." Jehonadab stood. "Then may he weigh your words and your heart alike." He turned to go, and Jehu's voice followed him, half mockery, half warning. "Keep your tents then. But remember, kings rise while shepherds wander." Jehonadab paused at the doorway. "Yes," he said quietly, "but kings also fall. The shepherds who fear God will still be standing." He left the hall and stepped into the cool night. The music and laughter faded behind him as he walked through the sleeping city. The smell of burnt incense still clung to the stones, faint and bitter. Outside the gates, his clan was camped beneath a ridge, fires burning low, children asleep beneath woven blankets, camels resting nearby. His eldest son, Malchiah, rose as Jehonadab approached. "Father," he whispered, "were you honored by the king?" Jehonadab looked back toward the glow of the palace. "Kings honor themselves," he said. "Our honor comes from obedience." He sat beside the fire and gathered his sons close. "Listen to me," he said. "You have seen what happens when power blinds a man to righteousness." Jehu began with zeal, but ended with compromise. "Let our family never forget. Comfort will always test obedience." One of the younger boys asked timidly, "But father, will the king be angry with us?" Jehonadab stared into the flames. "Perhaps, but I fear disobedience more than anger. The Lord has given us a calling to live simply, to walk humbly, and to remind the world that obedience outlasts every throne." They sat in silence for a while, the desert winds sighing through the camp. The stars glittered overhead, cold and clear. Finally, Jehonadab spoke again, softer now. "Someday, long after I am gone, this vow will still stand. Keep it. Teach your children to keep it. Let the tents remind them that our true home is not here." He leaned back, eyes half closed, as if listening to something only he could hear, the quiet voice of conviction that had guided his father before him and would, he hoped, guide his sons after. In the distance, the faint sound of a trumpet echoed from the palace, a signal, or perhaps a warning. Jehonadab looked toward it, his face unreadable. "Let them blow their horns," he murmured. "We will keep the silence of obedience." He closed his eyes and rested his hand on his son's shoulder. "Remember this night," he said. "This is where our legacy begins." Years passed like wind through the desert. Kings rose, kings fell, but Jehonadab's clan still moved through the wilderness in quiet obedience. Their tents dotted the hillsides, woven from goat hair and patience. They lived by the same rules their father had spoken: no wine, no houses, no fields. And though the world around them changed, the Rechabites did not. But time is a patient tester of vows. By now, Jehonadab's beard had grown white. His sons were men, his grandsons growing strong. He watched them from his tent door each morning as they tended flocks and repaired ropes, as they taught the children the old songs of faith. They lived simply, yes, but not bitterly. Their laughter carried across the valley like the sound of streams. Yet in every generation, temptation comes dressed as progress. One evening, as the sun sank into a red horizon, Jehonadab's eldest son, Malchiah, approached him with a furrowed brow. "Father," he said, lowering himself beside the old man, "the traders from Samaria passed through again today. They laughed at us. They say we live like beggars while others feast. They say even Jehu's sons now dine in palaces." Jehonadab stirred the fire with his staff. "Let them laugh," he said quietly. "The laughter of the proud is the music of those who forget." Malchiah hesitated. "But the people of Israel are building homes of cedar. They have wells that never run dry. We wander from place to place, never sure of tomorrow. Sometimes our wives whisper, asking why our tents must always move." Jehonadab looked into the flames, their glow lighting the deep lines of his face. "Because when a man roots himself too deeply in this world, he forgets the one that lasts forever. Our tents remind us that we belong to God alone." Malchiah frowned. "But father, What if our children grow weary of wandering? What if they wish for what others have? Jehonadab turned toward him, his voice firm but kind. Then we will remind them who we are. A family that walks in obedience leaves a mark no palace can match. The world may forget our names, but God will not. As night deepened, Jehonadab rose and walked to the edge of the camp. From the ridge he could see lights flickering in the distant city, tiny golden dots against the dark. He imagined Jehu's descendants feasting in marble halls, toasting their victories, praising their own power. Yet he knew how quickly pride rotted the heart. Behind him, the tents stood still and silent, their forms outlined by the firelight. They were fragile things, cloth and rope, but they held something no palace could contain: faithfulness. Jehonadab whispered to the wind, "Let these tents outlast the thrones." The next day, word reached the camp. Jehu was dead, and his son Jehoahaz had taken the throne. But already the whispers followed. Jehoahaz had returned to the idols his father never destroyed. The golden calves still stood. The people's hearts were wandering again. That night, Jehonadab gathered his family. The air was heavy with sand and silence. "You have heard the news," he said. "Another king has fallen into the same sin. Remember what I told you. The obedience of one family can stand as a wall against a nation's rebellion." His grandsons sat close, their young faces lit by the fire's glow. One of them, barely 12, asked, "But what can we do, grandfather?" "We are only shepherds." Jehonadab smiled faintly. So was David before he became a king. So was Moses before he led a people out of bondage. The Lord does not measure by power, but by purity. Every time we choose obedience over comfort, heaven takes notice. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain from the distant hills. Jehonadab's eyes grew distant. One day, long after I am gone, our people will face a great trial. Armies will come, cities will burn. But if you hold to this vow, if you stay faithful, God Himself will remember you, and He will honor you before kings. His sons looked at each other, uncertain whether to believe such a promise. But Jehonadab spoke with the calm of a man who had walked with God long enough to know His patterns. The days that followed were peaceful on the surface, but a quiet unease crept through the camp. The younger men sometimes spoke of settling down, of buying land, planting vineyards, raising walls. They spoke of comfort, as though it were safety. One afternoon, as the family gathered water from a nearby spring, a stranger appeared, dusty, cloaked, eyes sharp. He carried news from the north. "The house of Jehu grows corrupt," he said. "Israel's kings turn their faces from the Lord. Prophets are mocked in the streets." Jehonadab listened, his heart heavy. "Then the word of God will soon fall on them again." The stranger looked him over. "And on you, old man, if you keep standing apart." Jehonadab smiled faintly. "That's what standing apart is for." He turned back to his sons. "We will not move closer to corruption to feel safe. We will move farther away to stay clean." That night, thunder rolled across the horizon. The rain came in sheets, drumming against the tents, flooding the dry riverbed. As lightning split the sky, Jehonadab sat awake, praying softly for his family. Each flash of light illuminated his face, aged, tired, yet peaceful. He had lived long enough to see kingdoms crumble and idols return. But the vow still stood, alive like fire in his blood. When the rain quieted, he whispered to himself, "They will forget me, but they will not forget what I've taught them." Outside, The water washed over the sand, erasing the footprints of the day. Yet the tents stood firm, each one a small defiance against the storms of history. Years rolled forward like desert winds, wearing down even the strongest stone. Jehonadab grew frail, his body slower, his voice softer, but his conviction never dimmed. The man who had once stood beside kings now sat beneath the same humble tent where he had first taught his sons the ways of obedience. Outside, the camp of the Rechabites stirred quietly. His children and grandchildren tended the flocks, mended ropes, and taught their own children the stories their grandfather had lived. From the youngest to the oldest, each knew the vow that defined them. It was more than a rule, it was a heartbeat. But deep inside, Jehonadab carried a private worry. He could see how easily the next generation was tempted by the world beyond the hills. When traders passed through the valleys with bright cloth, silver ornaments, and flasks of strong wine, some of the younger men stared too long. Some asked questions that sounded too much like curiosity. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Jehonadab called his sons and grandsons into his tent. The air outside hummed with the sound of distant crickets, and the golden glow of the fire lit his weathered face. "My sons," he said, his voice thin but steady, "I have walked this road many years. I have seen how kings rise and fall, how idols return after every storm. But there is one truth that stands when all else fails. God honors families that live by righteous principles across generations." The men leaned in closer. Malchiah, his eldest, knelt beside him, holding his father's hand. "Father, you have led us well. We will not forget." Jehonadab shook his head slowly. "Do not remember me. Remember the Lord who called us to live apart. The day will come when others will mock you for your obedience. They will call you strange. They will call you stubborn. But let them speak. Every family that stays faithful in a faithless world becomes a light." He coughed softly, catching his breath. The tent was silent except for the low hiss of the fire. "Father," said one of his grandsons, "why did you never build a house, even when you could?" Jehonadab smiled faintly. "Because I never wanted to teach you to love walls more than the word. When you live in tents, you learn to hold the world loosely. Everything can be packed away but faith. That must be the one thing you never fold up and leave behind." The men exchanged quiet glances. The truth of his words pressed into them like a seal. Then Jehonadab lifted his gaze toward the tent flap where the night wind whispered. "Do you hear it?" he asked softly. "Hear what, father?" Malchiah said. "The world calling," Jehonadab murmured. "It never stops. It tells men to build higher, drink deeper, live louder. But listen carefully. Obedience is a quieter voice. You have to choose which one you will follow." Malchiah squeezed his father's hand. "We will follow the quieter one." Jehonadab's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then you will live." He motioned for his sons to bring a jar. When they did, he dipped his fingers into oil and drew a small mark on each man's forehead, a sign of covenant. "This is the vow of our house," he said solemnly. "You will drink no wine, build no house, sow no field. You will live as sojourners, that your hearts may stay pure before the Lord. And when your children ask why, tell them it is because God once found a family willing to obey." The men nodded, their eyes glistening. The room felt heavy with the weight of eternity. Later that night, the camp grew still. The fires burned low, and Jehonadab sat alone outside his tent, looking at the stars. The cool air brushed his face like a memory. His mind wandered back to the chariot ride with Jehu, the rush of wind, the blaze of zeal, the smell of fire and blood. He remembered how the king had promised to serve the Lord and how pride had stolen that promise away. "Even the strong forget," he whispered to himself. "But you, Lord, never forget." He leaned back, the stars bright in his fading sight. He thought of his father, Rechab. He thought of the tents that had stood through storms. He thought of his sons and the ones who would come after, walking in obedience he might never see. As the first breeze of dawn stirred the edges of his cloak, Jehonadab smiled, a weary, contented smile. "Faithfulness," he whispered. "That's the only inheritance that lasts." When the sun rose, the camp found him still seated at the tent's edge, his face turned toward the light, his hands folded in peace. He was gone, but his vow remained. The Rechabites buried him quietly in the hills. No monument marked the place, no stone bore his name. But from that day on, whenever his descendants broke camp, they said the same words before the fire was out. Jehonadab walked with kings and bowed only to God. They packed their tents, lifted their children, and carried the vow onward, generation after generation, their obedience echoing like a song across the wilderness. And though the world around them would change, though cities would rise, kingdoms would crumble, and new rulers would fill the thrones, the Rechabites remained. Because one man had chosen the narrow path. Because one family believed that faith could outlive everything else. Centuries passed like sand through an unseen hourglass. Kingdoms fell, new kings rose, and the once mighty walls of Israel crumbled under the weight of its own rebellion. Yet somewhere in the chaos of history, in a dusty valley not far from Jerusalem, the tents of the Rechabites still stood. They were no longer many, a few families, their herds small, their possessions few, but they still carried the same vow that Jehonadab had spoken long ago. No wine, no houses, no fields. They remembered his words as if he had spoken them only yesterday. For the story had been told by firelight from father to son, from mother to child, through generations of wandering faithfulness. The world had changed, but their obedience had not. One gray morning, a cloud of dust rose along the road as foreign soldiers marched past, their banners striped with Babylon's colors. The people of Judah trembled. The city gates were guarded by fear more than soldiers. And yet, through all this unrest, the Rechabites remained quiet. They lived just outside Jerusalem's walls, in tents that flapped softly in the wind. Inside one of those tents sat Jazaniah, a direct descendant of Jehonadab. His beard was streaked with gray, and his eyes carried the same steady calm that had marked his ancestor. Around him sat his sons, Hanan, Malchiah, and Rehob, and their wives and children. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky like distant drums of war. "Father," Hanan said, glancing toward the city, "rumor says the prophet Jeremiah walks the streets again. They say he speaks of judgment, that the Lord will destroy this city for its sins." Jazaniah nodded slowly. "He speaks truth. This city has forgotten the covenant. They build houses, plant vineyards, drink wine, and call rebellion worship, but we will not join them." Rehob frowned. "People mock us, Father. They say we are stubborn, that we live like ghosts in a world of kings." Jazaniah smiled faintly. "Let them mock. When judgment falls, the ones who live lightly will rise faster." A boy's voice came from the corner of the tent. It was little Eliab, Jazaniah's grandson. "Grandfather," he asked, "will we always live in tents?" Jazaniah looked into the boy's wide eyes and felt something stir in his chest. "Yes," he said gently, "and one day you will tell your children why. Because once, long ago, a man named Jehonadab made a promise to God, and God never forgot." Before Eliab could ask another question, footsteps approached outside. The tent flap opened, and a messenger entered, dusty from travel. "Jazaniah, son of Habazaniah," he said, bowing slightly, "the prophet Jeremiah calls for you. He asks that you and your sons come with him to the house of the Lord." The family exchanged uneasy looks. The temple was not their home. They had not stepped inside its stone walls in years. Jazaniah rose slowly. "If a prophet of the Lord summons us," he said, "then we must go." They followed the messenger through the crowded streets of Jerusalem. People stared, men in robes, merchants, and children. Whispers rippled behind them. "Those are the tent people, the Rechabites." Inside the temple, the prophet Jeremiah stood waiting. His eyes were sharp and kind all at once. He greeted them with respect. "Sons of Jehonadab," he said, "you have kept yourselves apart from this corrupt city. Today the Lord tests your faithfulness before all." He gestured toward a table where pitchers of wine had been set out, gleaming in the lamplight. The fragrance filled the room, sweet, rich, tempting. "Drink," Jeremiah said. "Take and refresh yourselves." The men froze. Jazaniah's sons looked to him. The silence grew heavy, broken only by the faint drip of wine from the pitcher's lip. Finally, Jazaniah spoke. "We will not drink." Jeremiah tilted his head. "Why not?" "Because," Jazaniah said, his voice firm and steady, "our father Jehonadab, son of Rechab, commanded us. You and your children must never drink wine, build houses, or plant fields. You must live in tents all your days, that you may live long in the land the Lord gives you. We have obeyed him in all things. We have not drunk wine to this day." The prophet studied their faces, then slowly smiled. "You have spoken well." He turned toward the gathered priests and elders who stood nearby watching the scene. Jeremiah's voice rose, echoing through the temple's pillars. "Thus says the Lord of hosts, go and tell the men of Judah and the people of Jerusalem. Will you not learn obedience from these men? The words of Jehonadab have stood for centuries, and his sons still obey him. Yet I have spoken to you again and again, and you have not listened. Because the sons of Jehonadab have remained faithful to their father's command, I will bless them. Jehonadab's descendants will always stand before me." A murmur filled the temple. Some bowed their heads in shame, others turned away, unwilling to face the rebuke. But Jazaniah and his sons remained still, their hearts trembling, not from pride, but awe. For they realized something holy had just happened. Their obedience, small and steady, had become a sermon for an entire nation. When they left the temple, the city buzzed with whispers. Some mocked them again, but others wept. For a brief moment, the people saw what faithfulness looked like in human form: quiet, ordinary, unbending. Outside the city, as dusk fell, the Rechabites returned to their tents. Jazaniah looked up at the stars and whispered, "Jehonadab, you were right. The Lord has remembered." His sons knelt beside him, and they prayed together, the same prayer Jehonadab had once whispered under another sky so long ago. "Lord, keep us faithful when the world forgets you. Let our tents be a witness that obedience still lives." And the wind, gentle and warm, seemed to carry their words far beyond the hills of Judah, upward, toward the same God who had once honored their ancestors' vow and now sealed it forever with his own promise. Jehonadab, son of Rechab, will never fail to have a man who stands before me. The days following Jeremiah's prophecy were heavy with tension. The streets of Jerusalem buzzed with rumors. Babylon's armies were marching closer, and the people whispered that the end was near. Yet even in their fear, few repented. Merchants still opened their stalls, rulers still schemed, and the priests still went through the motions of worship, blind to the thunder building on the horizon. But among the tents outside the city walls, the Rechabites lived differently. They had no vineyards to guard, no storehouses to defend, no palaces to protect. They woke each morning to the wind's voice, trusting the same God who had carried their fathers through deserts long ago. One night, Jezaniah, the eldest of the Rechabite clan, sat awake by the fire. He could see the faint glow of Jerusalem in the distance, the torches burning along its high walls, a false symbol of safety. His sons slept beside him, wrapped in wool blankets, their children huddled nearby. The fire cracked softly. From the darkness came footsteps. A familiar voice called, "Jezaniah." He turned. It was Jeremiah, the prophet of God, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. His robe was torn, his hair gray with dust. "The word of the Lord has come again," Jeremiah said. "The king has refused to listen." The people mocked the warnings. Babylon will break these walls. Jezaniah's heart tightened. "And what of you, prophet? What will you do?" Jeremiah looked toward the city. "I will speak until the last stone falls. But you, take your family and go. You have obeyed the voice of your fathers. Now obey the voice of the Lord. Leave this city before the fire finds it." Jezaniah's sons stirred at the sound of Jeremiah's voice. Malchiah, the youngest, rubbed his eyes. "Is it time?" "Yes," Jezaniah said quietly. "It is time." They gathered their few possessions before dawn, their tents, their tools, their scrolls that carried the stories of their ancestor Jehonadab. The sky was a pale gray when they lifted their children and started walking east, away from Jerusalem. The city behind them still slept, unaware of the doom already marching toward it. By midday, they reached the ridge overlooking the plains. Jezaniah stopped, leaning on his staff. The horizon was dark with movement, soldiers, chariots, dust. Babylon was coming like a storm that had been building for years. Jeremiah had followed them part way. He stood beside Jezaniah and said, "You are blessed among men, son of Jehonadab. While others perish in rebellion, your obedience will preserve you." Jezaniah bowed his head. "Not because of our strength, but because of his mercy." Jeremiah nodded and lifted his hands toward heaven. "May your tent stand long after these walls fall." Then he turned and walked back toward the city, his lonely figure fading into the haze of dawn. That night the Rechabites camped beside a dry riverbed. The wind howled like a warning. From far away they could hear faint thunder, but it was not thunder. It was the sound of war. "Will the Lord protect Jerusalem?" asked young Eliab, clinging to his father's arm. Jezaniah sighed. "The Lord protects those who obey him. The city has forgotten. We have not." The next day, smoke began to rise from the west, thin gray trails that twisted into the sky like fingers. The sound of battle echoed faintly across the hills. The children asked questions, but the elders answered with silence. By the second night, the smoke was darker, thicker. The glow of fire flickered on the horizon. Jerusalem was burning. Jazaniah stood on a ridge and watched in silence. His sons stood beside him, their faces pale in the firelight. None spoke. The city that had mocked them, the city that had laughed at their tents and vows, was collapsing under the weight of its sin. At last, Jazaniah whispered, "Jehonadab's words still live." Rehob nodded slowly. "The vow protected us." "No," Jazaniah said, his voice trembling. "The God who saw our obedience protected us." Never confuse the rule with the relationship. They turned away from the burning city and began their journey deeper into the wilderness. For weeks they wandered, finding shelter among caves and valleys, moving wherever the Lord led. Their flocks were small, but they never went hungry. Their tents wore thin, but they never went cold. One evening, after many days of travel, they came to a quiet place between two cliffs where a small stream ran clear and cold. Jazaniah stopped. "Here," he said, "we will stay until the Lord calls us elsewhere." That night they built no walls, no altars of stone, only a circle of fire where they prayed and told their children the story of their ancestor once more. "Jehonadab walked with kings," Jazaniah said softly, his eyes reflecting the flames, "but he bowed only to God. Remember that. Kings come and go, kingdoms rise and fall, but obedience builds eternity." The youngest child, a girl named Tirzah, looked up and asked, "Grandfather, will God remember us too?" Jazaniah smiled faintly. "He already has." The fire crackled. The night wind whispered through the valley, carrying the faint echo of collapsing walls far in the distance. But in that quiet wilderness, the Rechabites slept safely beneath their worn tents, untouched by the destruction that had swallowed Jerusalem. They had no riches, no armies, no power, but they had something greater, the protection of obedience. And though centuries would pass and kingdoms would continue to crumble, the descendants of Jehonadab would still walk the earth, living as strangers but standing as witnesses, proof that God does not forget faithfulness no matter how much time passes. As Jazaniah lay down that night, the last glow of the fire fading beside him, he whispered a single prayer before sleep took him. "Lord, let our tents remain a testimony. When cities fall, when empires fade, when all else is dust, let obedience still be standing." The wind carried the words into the night, across deserts and ruins, into eternity. The fires of Jerusalem had faded, but their smoke lingered in the memories of all who survived. The once great city now lay in ashes, its temple shattered, its streets empty. The people of Judah were scattered, some slain, some enslaved, some marched in chains toward Babylon. But far beyond the reach of Babylon's soldiers, hidden among the rugged cliffs east of the Jordan, the Rechabites still lived. They had lost friends, they had lost neighbors, but they had not lost faith. Their tents stood in a quiet valley watered by a small spring. Goats grazed along the hillsides, and children's laughter echoed softly in the dry air. The world's kingdoms had collapsed into chaos. Yet here, among these tents, peace had somehow survived. Jazaniah, now old and bent, leaned on his staff as he walked the camp each morning. His sons still honored the vow of Jehonadab. They drank no wine, planted no fields, and built no homes of stone. They lived light, and because of that, they could move when danger came. But the world outside their valley grew darker with every year. Babylon's empire expanded like a storm, swallowing every nation it touched. Traders who passed through the desert carried tales of kings imprisoned, cities rebuilt in the name of idols, and temples filled with false gods. One afternoon, Jezaniah's youngest grandson, Eliab, now a man, returned from a journey to the nearby villages. His eyes were wide with what he had seen. "Grandfather," he said, "Babylon's shadow reaches even here. Their messengers build roads. Their soldiers march across the valleys. They demand taxes. They build altars to their gods. Even our people whisper that we should settle, that we should make peace with the empire and live as they do." Jezaniah sighed, lowering himself to a rock. His hands trembled with age, but his voice still carried authority. "Eliab, the temptation to belong will always sound like peace, but it is the kind that kills the soul." Eliab frowned. "But what if they come for us, grandfather? What if Babylon finds our tents and forces us to serve their idols?" Jezaniah looked into the distance where the desert shimmered with heat. "Then we will do what our fathers did. We will obey God in exile, as we did in freedom. The land may change, but the Lord does not." That night, as the campfire burned low, Jezaniah gathered his sons and grandsons. "You must listen to me," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "When I am gone, you will face what Jehonadab foresaw, a world that worships power and forgets obedience. You will live among men who drink deeply and think themselves wise. You must not bend to them. You are not here to blend. You are here to remind." The men nodded silently. Even the youngest could feel the weight of his words. Weeks passed, and true to Eliab's warning, Babylon's soldiers appeared on the horizon. They came not as conquerors, but as collectors, gathering those who could serve the empire. Their commander, a tall man with a sharp beard and a voice like thunder, rode into the valley with a dozen horsemen. "Who are you people?" he demanded. Jezaniah stepped forward, leaning on his staff. "We are sons of Jehonadab, the Rechabite." The commander frowned. "You owe tribute to Babylon. Where are your vineyards, your crops, your fields?" "We have none," Jezaniah replied. "We live by the command of our Father and the will of our God." The commander's brows knit in confusion. No fields, no wine, no city. "Only tents," Jezaniah said. The man studied him for a long moment, then laughed harshly. "You have nothing we can take. You are no threat and no use." He turned his horse. "Stay in your wilderness, old man. Babylon will forget you." When the soldiers rode away, Eliab exhaled in relief. "They think us worthless." Jezaniah smiled. "Then we are safest of all." The years that followed were hard, yet strangely blessed. Famine swept across the land, but the Rechabites had always lived on little. Armies marched, but they had no walls to besiege. While others fought for kingdoms, the Rechabites built faith instead. Every night under the open stars, the elders told the story again, the story of Jehonadab, who once rode beside a king but chose to serve a greater one. The story of how obedience had preserved their people when kingdoms fell. The children grew up knowing that their identity was not in wealth or comfort, but in faithfulness. One evening, after many peaceful years, Jezaniah lay beneath the stars. Eliab knelt beside him, knowing his grandfather's time was near. "Do you regret it?" Eliab asked softly. "Living as wanderers while the world built its cities." Jezaniah smiled faintly. "No. Cities crumble and kings fade. But look around you." Eliab glanced across the valley. The tents glowed faintly in the firelight. Children laughed. Prayers rose on the night breeze. There was no palace, no wall, only faith. "Our people still stand," Jazaniah whispered. That is enough. He closed his eyes and took a final breath, peaceful as a man who had walked in obedience all his life. The next morning, the family buried him beneath a single olive tree near the stream. No monument was built, no words carved in stone. The only record of his life was the vow he had passed on and the faith that lived in his children's hearts. As years turned into decades, the Rechabites' name faded from history's scrolls. Yet somewhere in every generation, there was always a tent standing, always a fire burning, always a child hearing the story of Jehonadab. And every time the world fell into chaos, when kingdoms waged war, when idols rose again, when men forgot God, there would still be one family whose obedience remained like a light flickering in the dark. Generations came and went like shifting dunes. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, kings conquered and died, yet still, quiet and unnoticed, the tents of the Rechabites stood. Their names faded from the mouths of nations, their faces forgotten by rulers, but not by God. They moved as the seasons commanded. They grazed their flocks along the edges of the Euphrates, then returned toward the land of Judah when peace allowed. They never built cities. They never planted vineyards. When they traded for grain or oil, they spoke softly and left quickly. They lived as strangers in every land, content to be known by heaven rather than history. And so the years turned into centuries. Babylon crumbled into dust, Persia rose, then Greece, then Rome. The world changed its masters again and again, but the Rechabites lived beyond the reach of every empire. They belonged to no king but God himself. In time, the descendants of Jehonadab found their way back toward the hills of Judah. The valleys were quieter now, empty of idols, though the land still bore the scars of war. The olive trees grew wild again, the stone ruins of old Jerusalem half swallowed by vines. The people who now lived there barely remembered the prophets' names, much less the Rechabites. One spring morning, a small band of travelers appeared along the road that wound between two cliffs. Their clothes were simple, their feet bare, and their camels carried tents and water jars. Among them walked a man named Micaiah, a direct descendant of Jehonadab. He was tall and weathered from years in the desert, his eyes calm and steady. At his side walked his son, Abner, who carried a bundle wrapped in cloth, the last scroll that held the story of their forefather. As they descended into the valley, they saw a group of farmers working near the ruins. The men paused their labor, startled by the sight of strangers leading herds. "Who are you?" one of them called. Micaiah stopped and smiled faintly. "We are sons of Jehonadab, the Rechabite." The farmers exchanged puzzled glances. "Rechabite," one muttered. "I've never heard of such a people." Micaiah nodded. "Few have. But we have always been here, though the world forgot." The men shook their heads in disbelief and went back to work, but an old scribe nearby overheard them. His eyes lit up with recognition. He limped forward, his voice trembling. "Jehonadab," he said, "the one Jeremiah spoke of? The family that obeyed their father's command for generations?" "Yes," Micaiah said quietly. "That is our line." The old man looked at him in awe. "I thought your people were a story, a lesson, not a lineage." Micaiah smiled faintly. "We were both." Word spread quickly through the nearby towns. Priests and scribes came to see the strange travelers who claimed to descend from a man long dead. Some were skeptical, others amazed. One young priest, curious and bold, brought Micaiah before the council of elders in the rebuilt city of Jerusalem. They sat in a hall of rough-cut stone, sunlight spilling through broken windows. The high priest, Eleazar, leaned forward. "If what you say is true, show us proof." Micaiah unwrapped the cloth from his bundle and revealed the old scroll, its edges cracked with age. "This has been kept through every exile and every empire," he said. "It holds the vow of Jehonadab, son of Rechab." Eleazar handled it reverently, reading aloud the faded words, "You shall drink no wine, nor build houses, nor plant vineyards, that you may live long in the land your God gives you." He looked up, astonished. "You still live by this command?" Micaiah nodded. "Every word. We have no vineyards, no homes, no fields. We live in tents. The Lord has preserved us by this obedience." The hall fell silent. The priests exchanged looks, and one of them whispered, "It has been nearly 500 years. Micaiah's son Abner stepped forward. "And yet, our tents still stand." The high priest set the scroll down gently. Then Jeremiah's words were true. Jehonadab's line still stands before the Lord. "You are the living proof." Micaiah bowed his head. "Not proof of our strength, but of his faithfulness." That night, the people gathered outside the temple to hear the Rechabites speak. The story spread quickly through the city. The forgotten family had returned, still obedient, still faithful. Some mocked them as relics of a forgotten age, but others wept openly. An old woman in the crowd called out, "You have walked through centuries and still kept your vow. How did you not lose faith?" Micaiah looked out over the people and answered simply, "We remembered who gave it." The people grew quiet. For the first time in many years, a hush fell over Jerusalem that was not born of fear, but reverence. Later, as night deepened, Micaiah and his family camped just outside the city. The stars above them burned the same as they had for Jehonadab, for Jazaniah, for every generation that had obeyed. Abner lay awake beside the fire, listening to the wind rustle the tent fabric. "Father," he whispered, "will we always live this way? Will our children still keep the vow?" Micaiah smiled in the dark. "We will keep it as long as men forget it. When the world grows proud again, we will remind it that obedience still breathes." He turned his eyes to the stars, their light mirrored in the sheen of his eyes. "Jehonadab's name may fade from stone, but it will never fade from heaven. The Lord himself spoke it. That is enough." The next morning, as dawn lit the hills, the Rechabites struck their camp and moved on, leaving behind only footprints and a faint wisp of smoke that curled into the morning sky. To the people of Jerusalem, they were strangers again. To God, they were a promise still alive. For even as kingdoms crumbled, the vow of one obedient man still echoed through time, an ancient whisper carried by the wind. God honors families that live by righteous principles across generations. Morning came softly over the hills of Judah. Pale light spilled over the valleys where olive trees clung to broken terraces and birds nested in the ruins of what had once been palaces. The land was quieter now, humbled by centuries of war and wandering. Among those hills, in a small clearing where wildflowers grew through shattered stone, the Rechabites had pitched their tents once again. Micaiah rose early, his cloak drawn close against the chill. Around him, the camp stirred slowly. Women preparing bread over small fires, children chasing goats through the dew. It was a life the world would call poor, yet no one in that valley envied kings. There was peace here, the kind born only of obedience. As the sun climbed higher, travelers began to arrive. Word had spread that the mysterious people from the wilderness, Jehonadab's descendants, had returned. Scribes, priests, and even soldiers came to see them. Some came with curiosity, others with reverence. The oldest among the visitors was a gray-bearded priest named Zadok, who carried with him a new scroll freshly written by temple scribes. When he reached the camp, he bowed deeply. "Sons of Jehonadab," he said, "our fathers told us your story as a warning and a wonder. We have searched our records and found the prophecy of Jeremiah, written long ago. Because the sons of Jehonadab have obeyed their father, they shall never lack a man to stand before me." Micaiah bowed his head. "And yet we stand only because the Lord remembered his word." Zadok's eyes glistened. "We have rebuilt the altar, and we would honor the God who kept his promise. Will you come to the temple and bear witness so the people may see that his word still lives?" Micaiah turned toward his people. Some hesitated, others nodded slowly. They had not entered a temple in generations. Still, they felt the tug of something sacred, a circle closing after centuries of wandering. They struck camp at dawn and journeyed toward Jerusalem. Along the way, villagers emerged from doorways to watch them pass. Farmers stopped their plows. Children ran ahead, whispering, "The Rechabites are coming." The procession moved with quiet dignity. Simple people with sun-browned faces and steadfast hearts walking toward the city of their ancestors. When they reached the Temple Mount, the priests opened the gates. The sound of psalms drifted through the air, echoing against the marble courtyards. Micaiah's feet hesitated on the smooth stone. He felt small beneath the towering pillars. But when he looked up, light streamed through the open roof, and he remembered that even stone must bow to the sky. Zadok led them before the altar. There, in front of the gathered crowd, he unrolled the scroll of Jeremiah and began to read. His voice trembled as it filled the temple. "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel. Because the sons of Jehonadab have kept the command of their father and have obeyed him, I will keep my promise to them forever. There shall never fail to be a descendant of Jehonadab who stands before me." The words rippled through the crowd like wind over water. Micaiah felt the weight of centuries settle on his shoulders, the chariot ride of Jehu, the deserts of Jazaniah, the long nights of exile. Every sacrifice, every denial, every lonely step had led to this moment. When the reading ended, silence filled the courtyard. Then slowly the people knelt. Some wept, others lifted their hands in praise. And Micaiah, humbled and trembling, whispered, "The covenant still breathes." Afterward, he and his family were invited to eat with the priests. Bowls of fruit and cups of wine were brought, but as always, the Rechabites refused. The priests smiled knowingly now. What had once seemed stubbornness was clearly strength. "Your restraint rebukes our indulgence," one of them said softly. "You remind us what holiness looks like." That night, after the city quieted, Micaiah walked alone through the temple court. The stars burned bright above, as if the heavens themselves were listening. He spoke aloud, his voice low but firm. "Jehonadab, if your spirit could see this night, you would know your vow has not died. We have kept it, generation to generation, and God has kept us." A warm breeze stirred the hem of his cloak. Somewhere in the distance, a priest began to sing, a slow, ancient hymn about covenant and mercy. Micaiah closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. The next morning, before leaving the city, the Rechabites stood once more before the altar. Micaiah's son, Abner stepped forward carrying a small earthen jar. He poured its contents, clear water from their wilderness spring, onto the stones. "This," he said, "is our offering. We have no vineyards to give, no gold to bring, but this water has followed us through every generation. It is the symbol of our obedience. May it remind Israel that purity is stronger than power." The water trickled down the altar and shimmered in the sunlight. Some said it looked like silver, others swore it glowed like fire, and those who saw it never forgot. The Rechabites left the city quietly. They returned to their valley and to their tents, content once again with simplicity. Yet everywhere they went, stories followed them. Stories of the people who never broke their promise, the family that kept faith when nations did not. Years turned to decades. Micaiah grew old and passed the vow to his sons. Abner passed it to his. And still the tents rose and fell with the seasons. In every generation, someone remembered. Sometimes strangers would find them, pilgrims, scholars, or soldiers passing through, and ask, "Why do you live this way? Why no homes, no wine, no fields?" And the Rechabites would answer as their fathers had before them, "Because we belong to a promise that outlasts kingdoms. Our comfort is obedience. Our treasure is faith." When storms came, they moved. When drought came, they endured. And always, when the stars appeared, they told the children the story, how their ancestor Jehonadab once stood beside a king, how he chose humility over power, and how God took that quiet obedience and turned it into an everlasting covenant. Centuries later, long after even Rome's empire had turned to dust, travelers in the desert would still speak of a wandering people who drank only water, who built no houses, and who spoke of a God who never forgot. Some said they were myths. Others swore they had seen their fires glowing at night. But those who truly listened to the wind across the Judean hills would hear it whisper even now, soft, steady, unending. Faith can outlive empires. Obedience can survive oblivion. And God still honors families that live by righteous principles across generations.